Hey folks, another October may have come and gone, but I'm not quite done with horror yet. There's some leftovers I still haven't gotten the chance to talk about. So today, I'm going to be tackling the review copy I received of Game Changer Studios' My Lovely Empress, a visual novel X-management sim that serves as the most recent entry in their My Lovely series. And that's not all, because I'm also going to be delving into Rock Pocket Games' Moons of Madness, an atmospheric horror walking simulator. Now, given that they both take very different approaches to horror, it's time to ask that question. Did they provide lurid tales of lunacy, or was leaving the loveliest part of my experiences with these titles? I'm your host, Arlian. Let's find out together. And as for where we'll be starting, there's actually a bit I want to say about Moons of Madness. It's been on my backlog for a while, so let's get right into it. Premise-wise, you take the role of one Shane Newhart, an engineer stationed at Trailblazer Alpha, a secret research station on Mars. It's the be-all end-all of remote postings manned by a near-skeleton crew of researchers, all in the employ of the mysterious Orochi Company. Which is all good and fine, were it not for the fact that the extreme isolation is starting to get to, well, everyone. Nightmares have begun to plague the crew, serving to fuel odd superstitions and further fray the nerves of everyone present, to the point that not even unlimited coffee can fix everything. And yet, all of that pales in the face of what rests at the heart of Trailblazer Alpha, in the nature of the secretive research being done far from the watchful eyes of the rest of the world. And with that even said, can any good come from knowing what that research is, with nowhere to go? And on the whole, I found it to be a pretty decent setting, because it leans into a particular element of horror I've always loved, and that's a sense of abject isolation. It fuels a distinctly uncozy feeling of being trapped as you make your way through the story, one which perseveres even when you emerge onto the surface of the red planet itself, given you can't even stray all that far without risking your supply of oxygen simply running out. And the base is even worse, given the bulk of it is composed of tight, winding corridors. Your only solace, really, comes in the form of chatting with your fellow crew members. Except that you only ever do so over your intercom, which means as much as they can provide direction, it only further hammers home that disconcerting loneliness. And this isn't the only element it gets right either, because Moons of Madness does a great job of nailing the pacing. By and large, while the game does have some unsettling or startling moments, things are more of a focused slow burn approach to horror for a good chunk of the game, leaning more into paranoia bait rather than overt shock and alarm. That said, once things do start to ramp up, it continues to escalate in such a way that even when the game provides some breathing room, it's still far from cozy. So I'd say, as far as a stab at eldritch horror goes, I think it does the genre justice and makes for a lovely tie-in to its source media. Which, yeah, if you were wondering what initially got my attention, despite Moons of Madness being made by a separate developer, it actually takes place inside the same world as Funcom's weird horror MMO, The Secret World. And it does a great job of it too, providing neat tidbits of lore for veterans of that world, but laying them all out in such a manner that it doesn't alienate people who aren't as familiar. It's just really good, which is fundamentally a good thing, because on a mechanical level, Moons of Madness does stray towards the simpler side of things, given it's fundamentally an atmospheric walking simulator. A good portion of what you'll be doing throughout your time with the game is simply exploring and soaking in that story and experience. Yes, there is some bits of lore you can snoop around the areas for, but it is otherwise a fairly linear experience. That said, you might have noticed I specifically said a good portion of the time, and that's because there is a bit more to it than just walking around. Specifically, there come moments where the game implements a bit of light puzzle solving, and to its credit, while these are fairly spread apart, they're enjoyable on the whole and were fairly engaging, especially given they're all quite different from each other. There's also a few novel gameplay segments which help shift things up a bit more towards stealthily surviving, or quickly escaping, which does amp up the difficulty a little bit, but to the game's credit, the autosave is frequent enough that you'll never have to worry about any real progression loss. And speaking of loss, while there is technically an oxygen system to manage, like I've mentioned earlier, the game is forgiving enough with the placement of refill stations that you'll never have to worry about running out unless you're deliberately puttering around and waiting, or wander out of bounds, since that'll rapidly tank it. But yeah, that's the gameplay in a nutshell, which means it's time to talk shop about the graphics, and they're just good. Moons of Madness is a treat to look at and explore, and I frequently found it worthwhile to check out the environments just to see what it had squirreled away, or just to soak in the sights occasionally, since there are some nice Martian vistas to look out over. It's a pretty game, short and simple. That said, the part that I found the most arresting was the sound design. The voice acting in it is really good and helps to sell so many of the situations. That mix of casualness to that sort of shared awkwardness of two people laughing along despite things not being the greatest. Also, I do have to give credit to the music. It really does a great job of setting the scenes. But yeah, to sum it up neatly, Moons of Madness is quite good. The story's delightfully paced, and it does a solid job of providing an unsettling experience that gradually spirals into something truly awful, and which frequently left me uncertain as to where it was going or who I even had to trust. And as for the gameplay, while it wasn't the most complex endeavor, I still enjoyed the process and the puzzles that it occasionally provide. Really, if I had to figure out some sort of nitpick, it's simply the inclusion of a couple of the late game QTEs, but even those were more of a blip on the radar rather than any mainstay of the gameplay. Also, the stealth segments, while a bit tricky, are quite neat. So yeah, overall, I'd say this is a satisfying experience to sink your teeth into, and if you're a fan of a horror, you'd be outright remiss to pass this one over, so I can safely call it a hit. And with that said, that brings us over to My Lovely Empress, which, well, where Moons of Madness kicks off slowly, My Lovely Empress dives headlong into the tragedy, as it follows a grief-stricken emperor's desperate attempts to save his empress after she succumbs to a mysterious disease. Except by save, what I mean is that he's desperately scrabbling to avoid her soul disintegrating before he can conspire some means to resurrect her. A process that can only be achieved by, firstly, summoning demons, and secondly, using them to invoke nationwide disasters so they can harvest the souls of his citizens in order to feed the unholy ritual keeping her bound to the land of the living. Yeah. Things sort of spiral from sympathetic to utterly tyrannical crimes against humanity real quick. Acts which don't exactly inspire much confidence with the Imperial entourage and whose consequences might spread much, much further than he ever could have conceived of. Yeah. It is tragedy upon tragedy waiting to happen, and on a far larger scale than its other lovely predecessors. But the actual focus of the story remains the same, that being a grim character study of the protagonist as they sell their morals down the river. And the story it tells during the various dialogue scenes lodged within his chapters is certainly interesting, but there's something about the macro level of the game that puts a considerable amount of distance between your actions and their repercussions. Especially since the need to grow your population and build their happiness means you're largely running a weirdly benevolent dictatorship. Well, minus the whole undercurrent of death cult going on. In fact, you can actually get the kingdom thriving, to the point that the exchanges you get with other characters can occasionally feel a bit jarring. And speaking of jarring, a central theme in the earlier My Lovely Daughter and Wife games was the exploitative and altogether abusive relationships the protagonist holds with their familiars. There was this uncomfortable element to everything you were doing as you nurtured these homunculi or demons, courting their trust and happiness only to mulch them for resources needed to achieve the protagonist's goal at a somewhat consistent rate, which makes the Yao Guai and My Lovely Empress almost the complete opposite. See, rather than having this small circus of disposable minions to order around, you instead have a small selection that you can summon, each of which are irreplaceable. That's right, if you do choose to sacrifice one for one reason or another, they're gone for the rest of the playthrough. And let me tell you, the game goes out of its way to disincentivize the choice too, given you're penalized for leaving events unresolved, and the game will happily throw multiple events which only Yao Guai can do at you. So in the face of their prior games, it is a bit of an odd choice. Weird aside here, in the course of pursuing all of these endings, there definitely came times where I was hoping that I could just, set aside all of my vicious death culting and just let the Empress perish in favor of just having a benevolent dictatorship that wasn't eating the entirety of my populace. But yeah, no, I mean, if that's what you want to do, that's where the other side endings come up, because there are 4 neighboring rulers to woo. It's a narrative tangent at best, but they're fun to pursue given that each one of them have their own trials and tribulations they're dealing with. But like the Yao Guai story, the ending is determined rather abruptly by the final binary choice you come across before you marry them. Well, except for the best ending, which involves all 4 rulers, but you can figure that one out for yourself. But yeah, on the whole, while My Lovely Empress is conceptually interesting on a narrative level, the horror and discomfort of its earlier iterations are considerably dulled this time around, with my interest being largely focused on the direction the story was going instead. That and the mechanics, because this is by far the most difficult entry in the series. When I said you're running a benevolent dictatorship, I mean it, because without you calling all of the shots, things will catch fire quickly. See, the Emperor's job isn't just placating his citizens, it also entails making the nobles, merchants, and army amiable to his rule, which is really hard when they all want conflicting things from any major issue that crops up. For instance, if you choose to help civilians during a disaster, you might have the merchants breathing down your necks about cutting into the profits they've made from exploiting people, and from the nobles for favoring the common folk. It might make the soldiers happy though. And if these factions dip, their respective populations start to dive as well, which not only risks the possibility of them outright revolting against you, it also has the side effect of crippling your economy. You lose out on that sweet, sweet tax revenue because, yeah, you have to worry about those so you can buy upgrades for the kingdom or cover the cost of certain events. Not that you're going to be able to address them all in the first place, since there's a constant tide of events constantly churning out, and you only have a limited number, by default 2, action points to address them with, or Yao Guai to throw at them, and those also have their own energy pools to manage. So seriously, rush the upgrade that lets you have more action points ASAP, because My Lovely Empress is best defined as a constant war of attrition, where you're frantically trying to make sure everyone doesn't hate you, so you can get your population up, the taxes flowing in, everything working smoothly right until the next time you're forced to set fire to your own kingdom like a complete sociopath. You know what? I take it back. This is where the horror elements really kick in, because the dread of going through the process of building everything back up while maintaining favor with all of those factions is nightmarish. And it gets worse as the game goes on, because the speed at which the Empress's soul degrades continues to escalate as the days go by, which by itself is a rather nasty anti-stalling measure, likely put in place to avoid you stabilizing things too easily too early. It just also did a great job of causing me to resent the ever-living hell out of the deceased Empress. That said, it's not even the only anti-stalling mechanism either, because the game will start to throw events at you that will massively drain your gold if you've managed to finagle your taxes to a point where you're too comfortable. And it will throw these events at you daily if you've got a healthy economy going, which can wind up feeling a bit cheap, not only as a resource drain, but also as an action point drain, since leaving them ignored will chunk the favor out of all of your factions drastically. And if for some reason you've spent that money on an upgrade before the event comes, you can expect everyone to hate you anyways. Admittedly, this makes the Yao Guai and their events a little bit funny, because they're largely exempt from this action economy element. Like, yes, Yao Guai events will crop up fairly often, but you're able to summon up a fairly large amount of them, each with their own individual energy pools, and you're not really penalized for having that large amount. If anything, it's nice to have varieties. You can tackle type-specific events or send some of them off on errands for summoning components or to lure away certain citizen types from a different city over to yours, because you may have potentially crippled a certain faction in your city. Really, the biggest consideration I had to make was the passive abilities of each Yaogwei, since while a number of them are extremely helpful, such as being better at managing their energy, others will do things like, oh, I don't know, accidentally killing a chunk of your population when they air quote help with an event. Yeah, I made this Yaogwei a designated resource gatherer because, well, yes, they can get stronger by just doing the events you do or by feeding them civilians. And as they get stronger, this has the side effect of making the plagues they summon that you need to advance the game with and feed the Empress a lot deadlier. You can definitely handicap yourself if you're not careful by blowing up some 40 or even 50% of your population, and if you weren't careful and then had to go and make another plague shortly thereafter, you can whittle down all of your forces to a fraction of what they were. This is especially a problem if you evolve one of your Yaogwei because their stats ramp. But yeah, no, that's largely it for what you have to worry about for the mechanics and for the Yaogwei. I mean, there is a mechanic where you can sacrifice a Yaogwei to get a little shrine token that gives you a buff, but that requires sacrificing a Yaogwei, and the action economy hates you if you do that a bunch, or at all, really. So, no. This means it's time to address the visuals and how it differs from its predecessors. Specifically, I'm referring to the decision for My Lovely Empress to have all its characters be animated, which certainly looks interesting, but I'll admit I remain rather partial to the more illustrated stylings of its predecessor. They're not bad, far be it. I actually think it's pretty neat, and I cannot fault the overall aesthetics for the Yaogwei themselves, because there's definitely a neat cast of creatures to summon and to ascend, but I really do love the art for a number of the story segments and the endings, and it's really nice to actually be able to have a gallery for these and check back on them later. Beyond that, I think the sound design is decent, but there's nothing that really blew me away on this front. So yeah, we've reached the finale, and I have to say, this one's a bit of an odd experience because if I was strictly going by the merits of a horror game, My Lovely Empress does come across as a bit of a whiff compared to its predecessors, without even comparing it to Moons of Madness. Sure, it has its moments of gore and the implication of widespread misery, and there is a certain macabreness to the illustrations that accompany it, but it doesn't feel quite the same. It doesn't hit those same notes of unpleasantness or uncertainty that were hallmarks of the series. There's something a bit more impersonal about it all. Here's the thing though. While it might not have resonated with me as a horror title, I still felt that the story it wanted to tell was interesting. Yes, I did want a bit more from the narrative routes for the Yaogwei and the other rulers, but it's neat. Most importantly though, it provided a really challenging kingdom management sim. Like, you can scuttle your kingdom in the course of a single day or two if you are not careful, which made me extremely grateful for the copious amount of autosaves it makes. Balancing the needs of your spiritually taxidermied waifu versus that of your kingdom and its various factions can be brutal. And figuring out how to get ahead and actually make progress is something else entirely. It took my second playthrough to really master this after I'd barely scraped by during my first run. So on that front, I think My Lovely Empress does warrant being called a hit, even if it did fail to unsettle me. But then, if you need something unsettling, you do have Moons of Madness for that. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check out the description, and check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Green Witch Babby and Andy Noted. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts, and I do plan on updating the shirts and coffee mugs with some art of Yzma if there's enough people in the comments who say they'd like a shirt or coffee mug. In any case, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.